everyone, and welcome again to another version of the podcast Questions of Fire, where we bring driven people who are making an impact. Now, making an impact in this day and age means very, very different things. I'm delighted to have a guest who I started dialogue with a couple of years ago because he was already where a lot of us wanted to be. Um, and I mean that from multiple aspects. I'm a technologist, as you know. I'm doing technology for most of my life, but I'm also a lover of travel. I've lived in 12 different countries, and ideally, I'd live on a beautiful island and work from there. Well, what has Lewis been doing? He's been doing that for quite a number of years for some of the biggest tech companies in the world, and is a thought leader and we say avant-garde in this respect. So prior to COVID coming on board, he was already doing what is now starting to become possible for many people in many areas and in many business domains, which we'll get into later. But first of all, Lewis, thank you very, very much for joining us on the call.
It's my pleasure, Jonathan. Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. Absolutely.
Thank you. What I'd love to get into, the first part is ability of remote working. I know you're into so many other areas, whether that's knowledge management, it's collaboration, it's analytics of what's happening. But just the first part, because it's so prevalent and relevant right now,
Fine.
How and why did you make the decision, or an event happened such that you went to work in that direction quite a few years ago now? And you can tell people maybe your story, please.
Right, sure. So it's funny that you mentioned about how people are entering the world that I have been living myself for a good few years already. And in a way, it's true, because I started working distributedly 20 years ago when I was in another country, in the Netherlands. I was working for, at the time, IBM. And I was basically commuting to the office every day, like most people did before the pandemic and everything else.
Yeah.
And the peculiarity there is that my commuting time was 5 hours a day of commute.
Wow.
So it was 2 hours, 2.5 hours coming, 2.5 hours coming back, and all of that using public transport. So if something was late, it would increase and add up, right? So I did that, 25-hour wasted in commuting time for 2 years. So when people tell me, oh, Mianco, you've been working from where you are, you've been working distributively for so long, you don't know what commute is like. Believe me, I know what commute is. I experienced it for 2 years. And I keep telling people, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, I read it 3 times in those 2 years.
Wow.
3 times, right? But the thing is that my urge to start working away from the office, working from home essentially, was essentially because I was spending far too much time traveling to go to work, and then have to put the hours of work that I would normally do and then come back again. So I basically did not have a life other than work and sleep and sometimes eat, right? And that was my motivation at the beginning. And when I started, I remember how I started doing what a lot of folks are talking about right now, which is a hybrid workplace. So Sundays to the office and Sundays working from home. And I started doing to the office 2 days, Tuesdays and Thursdays, and then working from home Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, right?
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, people tell me that the hybrid workplace is the new normal, is what's going to happen from here onwards. And I go like, no, it's not, because to me, it lasted a year to work with that model, right?
Okay.
And it lasted for a year for one particular reason. And that was that after a year that I was doing that, my boss obviously wanted to see me, once or twice a week. So I would go on those 2 days. But at one point in time, after a year, I realized that I was more productive from home than at the office. So I went back to my boss and said to my boss, look, when I work from home, this is what I produce. These are my results, my outcomes.
Sure. Yeah.
And when I'm at the office, this is what I produce. And then he went like, my God, I don't want to see you. I want you to work from home all the time.
So the tangible benefits were clear.
Yeah, they were clear because I had, first of all, I didn't have any commute any longer. I could focus more on the work that I needed to do. I remember that when I used to go to the office, I used to get up at 5:30 in the morning every day, right? To arrive with everything done and everything else around 9:30 in the morning. And then, you will go there and you will go on and, plug in your computer, your laptop, then you will bump into your colleagues, you go for a coffee because you want to mingle with your colleagues,
Sure,
right?
sure.
On the way back, I would meet with my manager on the corridor, and they would say, oh, let's go and have another coffee and talk. And then at noon, I will be having lunch. So by the time that I would start my working day, it would be at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, after
Wow.
having woken up at
Yeah.
5:30 in the morning.
Hmm.
So to me, it was relatively easy to showcase how I was much more productive from home than I was at the office. And that's how I switched after a year to full-time remote and working distributedly. And shortly afterwards, so 18 months later, I moved to the Canary Islands, to Gran Canaria, where I have been living now for the last 17 years. Right.
Wow. Wow.
Now, I'm not saying that everyone is going to follow that process,
Sure.
but I do know that the hybrid workplace is got a time limit, and that time limit is the moment that people realize how much more productive they are working from home, and how what they will do. And when I'm saying working from home, it can be working from anywhere, you
Sure.
know, because what you do there is you actually shift the focus away from the hours that you do into the results that you produce, right? And the moment that you do that, you will no longer go to the office. And if you go to the office, you will only go to the office to socialize. So I work now for a small firm, Pan Agenda, doing
Yeah.
analytics, as you well know.
Hmm.
And before the pandemic, I used to go to the office once or twice a year. And the only thing that I would do while I was there was socializing with my colleagues, as in terms of, doing team building and getting together and discussing work items. But the vast majority of the work was already done online, right? That's what I envision will be the new normal for a lot of different folks. And if they want to take it into the extreme and move to a place like I did, like Gran Canaria, like their favorite holiday destination,
Sure.
that to me is the icing on the cake, right? It's not necessarily what I know a lot of people will do, but it's an opportunity there, right? But I do know that the way we used to work until the pandemic, that's gone for everyone, right?
So
And what we're doing now is just an opportunity to rethink what we want work to look like.
this is where I think it's the difficulty is, Lewis, for a lot of people who've been working in an office or even a semi-hybrid mode, the idea of, particularly depending on the type of work you do, how feasible that shift is going to be. So I come very much from a technical world. So in my developer roles, which I haven't done now
Mm-hmm.
in years, I would
Mm-hmm.
imagine that a very easy thing to sort of make the transition. You tell me what functions you want developed, I'll coordinate through video, etc., and do that.
Right.
Then, if we go into sort of project management or business management, where particularly when you're initiating brand new initiatives and you're trying to syndicate, understanding of those initiatives, etc., complex is particularly when you're talking about complex work. There's a lot of requirements requiring a lot of stakeholders, and bringing a team together was always seen. And you would even try within an office building to get within one or two rooms your team together, because you want to, we say, confront the complexity of a potential project as
Mm-hmm.
quickly as possible. So I'm just going to go
Mm-hmm.
straight for what I would see as the most difficult thing. How do projects, I'm using that as an example, or maybe you even have better examples of what are the ideas we're fixated with physical vicinity or proximity to each other, aren't as true as what they need to be. How could you maybe break that down for where we have beliefs that we need to be together? How can we actually, segment that, distribute that in an effective way? Because I also think we have a mindset that's not quite there. And that's the biggest part of the transition, not necessarily the tools, etc., which are already
Mm-hmm.
really in place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's important to mention two things in there first. Number one is that we humans adapt to anything that we're giving, right? And we can see that with what has happened with the pandemic for the last 15, 16 months.
Yeah.
Everyone that had the opportunity to work away from the office. So I'm not talking about, essential workers, people who needed to be the front line because they needed to do, the
Sure.
service like retail or, police or whatever. Those folks obviously had a need to be there physically, right?
Mm-hmm,
But
mm-hmm.
everyone else, we have adapted. we have adapted to the conditions that we had, to the tools that we had, and to the ways of working that we had. And then you will have the group of people who were basically, our power users, and they adapted really fine,
Yeah.
like no problem, no issues whatsoever. And then
Hmm.
you have other folks who maybe have struggled a little bit, right? And they couldn't do it because they didn't have X, Y, Z, and they didn't thrive, but they still did it. So the key message here is that we adapted. We adapted to new conditions that we were given. And the new
Yeah.
conditions that we were given were actually coming from something external, COVID-19, who told us either you adapt and change your ways or you die. And
Yeah.
we did, right? So that's important to keep in mind, because when you mention the topic around mindset, that's exactly it. For the vast majority of folks, we have shifted that mindset, but only under the thinking that it's just temporary for as long as the pandemic lasts. But what has happened in reality is at the moment that people have started working from home,
Yeah.
they started realizing that, hey, this is actually not too bad, because I'm getting my work done.
Hmm.
I'm perhaps even more connected with my colleagues because now I have a chance to see everyone and talk to everyone and connect with everyone. I'm much more time with my family, with my kids, with my pets, with my friends. So all of a sudden, I feel like things have actually improved in a whole lot of different areas. I'm sure that we will talk about this later in the conversation.
Sure.
So people may think and say, you know what, this is actually not too bad. I quite like doing this. What happens, and this is the challenge, is that a lot of people will tell you that they don't really like working from home because they're not used to it, right? They haven't built the routines, the habits, the discipline, the opportunity to actually try new things. And that's true. And the reason why that has happened is because we are going in the midst of a pandemic, right?
Sure.
We still are in the midst of the pandemic, right? So we need to understand that context. So the moment that the pandemic fades away, we will truly experience what working distributively is all about, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And the other context, which is the one that I can see and justify for people to go to the office, is that we will shift away from doing something that was very routine like, right? Every day I had to go to the office, and we will start using a keyword when going back to the office, and that keyword is deliberate. So I deliberately want to go to the office because there's something that I need to do that I cannot do elsewhere, or
Sure.
that I cannot get done anywhere, right? So the example that you gave about a new project, very complex, lots of stakeholders, lots of things to go and do with an entire new team.
Yep.
The opportunity there is deliberately go to the office and spend 1 or 2 days in workshops to get things sorted out, to give it a structure, to build a rapport with one another. Once
Exactly.
that's built, you can move away back to your home place and you will continue doing the work. And every now and then, when you feel that you need to discuss something really complex that cannot be solved online, you will decide and negotiate to go back to the office for that day. So the key message here is that deliberate action, right? So we will deliberately use the office for something that we cannot do elsewhere. And, like I said before, I've been doing this for 20 years. I mean, I've been working distributively for 20 years. I'm not going to say that every job can do that, right? Because there are jobs where you may not do it. I mean, if you're designing, for instance, or if you're doing design thinking and you use the four walls of a building
Sure.
to actually do a sticky notes and everything else, a screen is not going to do it for you, right?
Absolutely.
Uh, but we will adjust, because I know those folks, for instance, in that example, who now they use tools like Miro or Mural, and they love it more because they have the ability to hear everyone's voices. They have the ability to write down everything and document everything. So there is a history of everything going on. And they find it more effective to do it that way than face to face. So what we're going to see, and this is something that I have told a lot of people about, is we will see a lot of experimentation over the next year
Yeah.
in terms of defining the specific, unique use cases to work from the office, and everything else will move out entirely. And we will actually start working from home, or, while we're on the road, or while I am, traveling to whatever place, or on a co-living, co-working space, whatever it is, right? I think what is important now, which is critical for all of us to understand, is that work has to stop being a physical space and it's a state of mind. So you will think of work as something that you need to do, not somewhere you need to be. And that's huge, because that's the moment that you switch over from the time that you spend versus the effectiveness of what you do, versus the results, the outputs, the outcomes that you put forward. And that's critical to understand, because it helps you figure out that when you're doing a particular task, if you finish it within a particular time frame, it
Yeah.
does not mean that the rest of the time you're going to continue working if you don't need to, right? It's one of the things that I keep telling people about, that, whole work-life balance. There isn't that balance.
No.
It's work always wins, right? It's work-life integration. And this is what we're going to see a lot with this distributed work, that we will decide when to work, when to live, and both will be part of one single unit, us as individuals.
So I see two things there, Lewis. One is I like how you've made the deliberate or intentional mindset for where you're going to be. And I almost see the reverse of your initial situation where you talked to your boss and you said, well, here are the metrics from home, here are the metrics from the office. It may come to the point where the reverse conversation may need to happen. At home is the default, and justification to have an on-site or physical meeting is probably going to have to happen, because it's obviously more expensive. Everyone needs to get together in the same
Yeah.
place. So there's almost a reversal from your 17 odd years ago potential. I know we're not there
Yeah.
yet, but that's the direction.
Yeah, and actually, you will see how a lot of people will become a lot more conscious about the impact that it has provoked when they were going to the office. The fact that for the last 16, 17 months, they haven't traveled, they haven't picked up a flight, they haven't taken the car to drive 2, 3 hours back and forth, or heavily relied on public transport as they did. That has got a climate impact, right? A footprint that we're no longer doing in a way, right? And the fact that the time that you used to go to the office and everything else, that's time that now you have gained it to reinvest it into doing things that are much more meaningful, like for instance tucking your kids to bed.
Sure.
I have got lots of folks who tell me that the thing that they love the most is being now with their kids at home. Why? Because now they have an opportunity to see them grow, not when out of the office. So that kind of quality of life is going to have a huge impact, because it's going to help people understand that they have the opportunity to redefine how work happens in their terms, not in someone else's. So we will see how people will own the work that they do, whereas before they were being told the work that they needed to do. It's a huge shift that is happening right now, which is also why you see how there are certain groups that are actually reluctant to keep working from home, and they want to go back to the office desperately. Those are the ones who want to keep up with the status quo before the pandemic.
Sure.
Why? Because it was benefiting them, not the rest. The rest, which is the vast majority, have now opened up their eyes and said, like, boy, we're not going that way. The genie is out of the bottle. We know now that we can do better. We will do better. And it's a matter of whether you want to adjust. And if you don't want to adjust, we live. As we're saying with recent studies that are saying, I mean, I read the latest one, they're saying that up to 40% of employees are willing to leave the organization that they're working for, so their jobs, if
Sure.
they're not respecting working distributedly. If they're still encouraging people to go to the office, they're saying, well, if you're going to do that to me, I'll leave the organization. And I'm going to go to an organization that helps me thrive working wherever I want to work, right? So I mean, a lot of people are saying this war of talent, right?
Yeah.
Locationless. Well, I think it is more not necessarily that war of talent, but it's more like, be sure that you know what you're worth and who will be willing to pay for who you are and what you know, not where you live. And that's huge. Right?
So could I give you an analogy, Lewis?
Yeah, go
Being a
ahead.
technologist, we grew up with the idea of landlines for
Mm-hmm,
telephones. And
mm-hmm.
now in the last 20 odd years, and everybody has a phone, if not more than one phone. And we moved into being able to portably communicate with anybody. Is the world of work going through something similar? And the office is the landline, and the mobile phone is where you are. Are we effectively following that sort of evolution of technology where its location is less relevant?
Yeah, and to the point where if you would go and do like a survey and you will ask people, families and everything else, how many landlines they have, They will tell you that none. They only rely on the mobile devices. They don't need a line bank anymore. And that's exactly the transformation that we're going through, right? And what's happening is that just like we adjusted so quick to that way of not having to rely on the landline and then go with the mobile connectivity, we will do exactly the same thing in terms of how we work. Because, again, we're going through this transformation in the midst of the pandemic.
Yep.
So once the pandemic fades away, and a lot of the anxiety, fears, concerns, insecurities disappear because, with the pandemic,
Yeah.
things
Yeah.
will, once it's over, things will get better. We will start rethinking, how do we want to continue working, right? And we will start thinking, you know what, if I take out all of those anxieties from the pandemic and the fears and everything else, I have actually enjoyed working from home, you know? And that means that now I can establish what my schedule is. I can see what the tasks are. I can do them at my pace. I can keep the focus. And then whenever I would have a real need to go back to the office, I will talk to my colleagues and say, hey, on this day, I'm going to go to the office. Anyone else going to join? So it becomes an opportunity to negotiate
Yeah.
when you all were going to go together, right? But then analogy is brilliant because that's exactly the transformation that we're going through. And at one point in time, what you realize as well in there is that a lot of people, me included, and I will explain what I mean with this, we were not really conscious about how bad our health were or our health was
Yeah.
before the pandemic. I mean, I remember, and the reason why I'm saying this was, and you tell me, okay, but come on, you've been doing this for 20 years. I said, yeah, I was doing this for 20 years. But throughout those 20 years, I was doing a lot of traveling. I was doing a lot of traveling to conference events, to
Yeah.
customer sites, and everything else. And that put a strain on my body, in terms of, having to get up at 4:30 in the morning to catch a flight at 6 o'clock in the morning, right?
Mm-hmm.
Go to a conference and then be 2 or 3 days, little to sleep because you want to go to the conference and attend it and network with people and have drinks and have dinner and have more drinks. And then you end up in the ungodly hours of the morning. And then the next day you have to get up for breakfast. All of that stuff. Those of us who have been traveling for a while were exposed to all of that. And all of a sudden, with the pandemic, that disappeared. And you realize, like, my God, I feel healthy now. So maybe I need to cut down on my business traveling as well.
Yeah.
That's the big aha moment for me, thinking, you know, how can I justify now? And this is an example, for instance, how can I justify now to take a plane to go to another country, Germany, UK, Ireland,
Yeah.
whatever, for a 2-hour meeting, right? When I can just get a Zoom meeting.
Sure.
Before, it would be like 3 days. It would be one day of traveling, one day of the meeting, and one the other day of traveling, right? For me. So 3 days have now turned into a 2-hour Zoom meeting. How can I justify not doing that versus traveling again, right? So you can see here that one of the things that it's going to do is we're going to see a lot of our habits and behaviors being challenged constructively into, can I do things better? And even for folks who have been working distributed like myself for so long, we also get challenged in things that we did before the pandemic, that we didn't do throughout the pandemic, and that we actually saw the benefit. For me, for instance, business traveling, right?
Sure.
I mean, I was just commenting the other day. Yesterday I attended a virtual event, right, intra team in Copenhagen. Usually it would take place in Copenhagen, but this time was virtual.
Sure.
Uh, my favorite activity was, after an amazing day of wonderful conversations and a smashing lineup, my amazing favorite activity was finishing up the day walking on the beach with my dog.
Fantastic.
That's going to be very difficult to get me out of that next time that I need to go to a conference event, if you know what I mean, right? Because it
Oh,
gave me an opportunity to digest everything that I talked about, that I learned, that I, connected with, and everyone on the event and everything else. And at the end of the day, I was doing one of my favorite things, which is walk my dog along the beach. That's something that you won't be able to do
so you, what
that
you make
easily, right?
what you're making me think, Lewis, is I've traveled a lot. I've lived in a lot of countries, and we are almost intoxicated by interaction, by
Mm-hmm.
the whether that's going to the office or going to a conference or even going to coffee shops on a regular basis. It can be something very simple. Whereas now I'm
Mm-hmm.
very similar. I actually go for dawn walks with my dog. That starts my day, not necessarily finish it. And my health and lifestyle have increased dramatically. So I was just wondering, how has that changed us? Because I'm thinking of my own example, but you're longer doing this. I would say I'm probably a calmer person. I probably go for more walks. I'm definitely
Hmm.
drinking a hell of a lot less coffee. I have one with my breakfast or maybe the occasional other one. So just my
Hmm.
consumption of caffeine has gone through the floor, if you want. So, but all of those things and my desire to travel continuously, not just for work, but also, oh, I'd love to go here for the weekend, there for the weekend. Like,
Hmm.
obviously, it's gone to close to zero. So,
Hmm.
my costs and my personality have found a new equilibrium. I'm not going to
Right.
generalize and say that that's the norm, but since you're more involved in this, what are the studies or the analytics saying about how this is affecting people on an individual level?
Right. If you look into, and this is really funny to do because, or a very interesting reflection that you're saying there, because I remember, and I will, and you will see what I mean in the context with this example as well.
Sure.
So when the pandemic started last year around March timeframe, and we started to see the first lockdowns, the first restrictions across different countries,
Yeah.
people were then, told, you need to work from home and everything else. So Gallup, right, the research firm in the US,
Yeah.
did a study to measure the level of engagement and happiness and involvement for employees, right? And through that period of time, the worst, the most critical one, because that's when we were seeing a lot of, casualties, and it was horrible in different countries over here in Europe and
Sure.
Asia and everything else. It was dramatic. Uh, the results of that study was that people were more engaged, more involved, and happier working from home than going to the office, right? Now, Gallup did exactly the same study
Mm-hmm.
later in the year, around this August, September timeframe, and the engagement plummeted to the same levels that it had before the pandemic. Main reason that people were told that they needed to go back to the office, and that vast majority of the organizations that enable people to work from home, they did a big mistake, which was what they were doing at the office, we just need to do it now online. So if at the office I had four,
Sure.
five, six, 7 meetings, now I need to have 4, 5, 6, 7 Zoom
Kind of a
meetings,
direct
right?
translation as such.
Right, and that was a mistake because that was a mistake because it put a lot of strain in that digital overload that people are going through even now, right? Despite all the months, right?
Sure,
But
like
because we
I don't know
still,
if you saw the article by Jonathan Frostick on LinkedIn where,
right,
I don't want to sit in front of Zoom for the rest of my life type
right, right.
comment,
But that's but that this is the thing that is a bit of a pet peeve of mine, because once again we're blaming tools for our behaviors. The problem is not Zoom. The problem is our obsession with meetings. The problem is the obsession that we have of not trusting people, so that I need to force them to go into a web meeting so I can see their eyes and ensure that they're doing their work. The problem is not the tool. The problem is our behavior, is our habits. We haven't shifted those habits. We haven't done that leap of faith into trusting that employees will do the right thing. And yet, and I'm sure that you have seen this, apart from that Zoom fatigue that we're going through and everything else, you're also starting to see how a lot of companies install spyware software on people's machines at home to check that they're working.
Yeah,
Hello? Like,
yeah,
excuse me? I mean, that's not a problem to me with distributed work. That's not a problem with the technology. That's a much more fundamental problem,
of
which is with
trust.
HR. You're hiring the wrong people if you don't trust them. So
Hmm.
you are the problem, not the employees, I'm afraid. We haven't done that shift yet. And that's what I think needs to happen on a massive scale for these new ways of working. So working distributedly, working from anywhere, to stick around, right? And Jonathan, you hit it right on the head there. The main fundamental issue here is about trust. Do I trust my employees to do their work when I'm not seeing them? If your answer is no, you got a problem. If your
Yeah.
answer is yes, treat them as such. It's that simple, you
Uh,
know. And the thing is, how do you build trust with your teams when they're no longer in the office? I said, well, expose yourself. Start using the same digital tools that they're using. We're talking about using social digital tools where people can connect, talk about work, learn, and have conversations. So I think you have seen this a few times already, I'm sure. But one of the different skills that has been identified as a result of the pandemic as and considered critical to have within an organization is the ability to write and read properly.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because that's how we communicate online, right?
Yep.
Before, when we were at the office, we had body language that we all know is super important. But
Mm-hmm.
now that we're working away from the office, we no longer have that face-to-face contact. So what you do is you need to master the art of conversation with the writing and the speaking that you do. And that's going to become so critical that any organization that is not investing in those skills is missing a huge opportunity. Why? Because they will not allow employees to trust one another, or managers to trust their employees, because they don't know them. If you ask people, why don't you trust someone, and you dig in further, they will probably tell you that the reason why they don't trust that person is because they don't know enough,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
I had that from a lot of people. And I also had a couple of folks who said to me, no, you know what, you're wrong, because I know them so well that I don't trust them. And then I go like, yes, I'm wrong, but you're really messed up, because if you know them so well and you don't trust them, you're hiring the wrong people, which means that you have the issue, not them, you
So
know?
you've brought up, you've unveiled in my mind a thought, Lewis, that I never
Mm-hmm,
had before. Is within big organizations, particularly when they're physical presence, you
mm-hmm,
can get people who sort of bend the situation toward themselves and maybe take credit for things that they weren't theirs. I think in
mm-hmm.
a digital environment, that's more difficult because, there's traceability of who sent what
Yeah,
document
yeah,
and what video, where ideas actually began in a conversation. You can go back to a video and say, well, that's where it happened. So, if we have something here in the conversation and you bring up a fantastic idea and I go out and say, oh, I have this wonderful idea, we can actually go back to this conversation and say, well, hold on, if you listen to that conversation, Lewis is the one who said it and Jonathan was the one who tried to propagate it as his own. So it
yeah.
does also have maybe a potentially good impact of eliminating some of that, how would you say, perversion of credit, or whatever, the
And,
things that
and
go around in that way.
right, and you're very generous and diplomatic, because I will go and say that it just basically kills all of the political work, all of the bullying, all of the
Oh, yes.
brownie nosing, all of the corporate politics that go at the office. That it just kills all of that. Why? Because if you work online, because you're working distributively, if you want to keep up with their own behaviors, there's going to be a audit of that. There's going to be a tracking point of that, which means that people will know who's the asshole in the company,
Absolutely.
because now they can see it written down somewhere or said in a web meeting and everything else. And in fact, I'm gonna try to put a positive spin into this, right?
Sure.
Now, the positive spin to this is that when people tell me, okay, so what's more effective, working at the office or working from home? Because or working distributively, because when I feel that when I'm in the office, I get so much more done, because we're face to face, we have got this, physical rapport and everything else. And I go like, look, um, the most effective way of working is working distributively. Whatever people tell you about working from the office is not effective. And the reason why it's not because when you work face to face, you hardly document any stuff.
Mm,
When you're on a meeting, you are lucky if you have one person taking notes and one person taking the action items, right?
sure.
When you're on a web meeting, or when you are collaborating online, everyone leaves a trace. Everyone documents what's going on in the meeting. Everyone owns the action items that they have to do, because there's something that says this action item needs to be done by this person by such date. So working distributively will always be more effective, because it forces us to document what needs to be documented. And because we become so good at it, as in, I cannot waste time writing stuff that I know is not going to be worth it, right?
Sure.
I just write what I need, what I need to focus on, that I need to get done. So what you write and document is actually the good stuff, right? When you're face to face, you don't have that. You actually end up in going to endless meetings where everyone just goes blah 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 blah, and by the end of the meeting, nothing gets done, right?
Hmm.
Let's
Hmm.
face it, that's how meetings have happened all along, right? And now we have that documented proof, which means that, again, that corporate politics is no longer there, the bullying is no longer there, the brownie nosing is no longer there, the control is no longer there, because a lot of organizations, they had a significant percentage of the population, working population, especially managers, who were basically controlling their employees with a physical presence,
Sure.
that having that power, that status, that influence. And all of a sudden they have realized that online, they're just one square box, nothing else. And they need to demonstrate and earn the merit of everyone else in the room from that square, right? That Zoom window. And that changes the entire game, because the only way of how you're going to master that is how well you can master the art of the conversation. And conversations are two-way street conversations. So
Hmm.
you say something, you receive something. Whereas at the office, it's usually I push and you do and obey, right? So that power dynamics is completely shifted when you work distributively. That's why one of the things that I'm hoping that organizations will do is also spend the time to enable their senior leaders and their leaders, middle managers and managers, to
Yeah.
understand that the game has changed forever, and that the way they used to manage at the office, face to face, is going to be completely different to how they manage online, right?
And
For obvious reasons in that regard.
yeah, so from that perspective is, what a lot of what we do is working with different types of knowledge, and
Hmm.
you're onboarding new people into organizations, you're letting go of old people, but you want to retain some of their knowledge about either processes they develop, systems they develop, relationship with
Right,
clients.
right.
How, and I just want to explore this a little bit. Everything, if I think in the banking world, you've got a relationship manager or an account manager in the technical world. um
Right.
how do we manage that differently in a distributed world versus, obviously, I'm not going to meet you and have a coffee and talk through your same way. We'll do
Hmm.
a virtual coffee nowadays, but
Hmm.
how do we
Hmm.
manage, and I think you've already given me part of the answer, is now we will document more. And even if that document is simply a video, it doesn't necessarily mean written
Right.
down. There's referenceable material. So there must be an improvement on the way, at least with respect to organizational knowledge management.
Yeah,
What are
absolutely. And
your
and
thoughts on that,
you know
please?
what, this is one of the other areas where we have made a big mistake, right? Because instead of exploring all the potential options out there that we have in terms of how we document those relationships, how we work with those relationships and everything else, we have decided to default with what we're doing before, but more, right?
Hmm.
So we do more meetings, we do more private messaging, and we do more file sharing than ever before, right? Those are three major use cases that basically tell us that we have kept working pretty much exactly the same way before the pandemic. The only thing that we have done different is the volume. We have increased the volume because
Sure.
now we can no longer see, right? Now, the opportunity from a knowledge management point of view, and also from that documenting capability or the documenting perspective, is to look for those digital tools, social digital tools that we have that allow us to build conversations with people. I mean, I know that I'm preaching here to the choir, but if you look into Web 2.0 back in
Yeah.
2004, it was exactly that. How you could use different social tools, different digital tools to engage much more intimate, much more focused with particular customers through blogs, through wikis, through social networks, etc., enterprise social networking. So all of that was being left aside a little bit because a lot of people didn't understand why it was there. All of a sudden, is coming back again into the conversations because people are struggling to work pretty much like they were doing at the office online, right? Now, people tell me, okay, so I know that you also are the guy who doesn't use email when we live on email. So how do you keep up with the customers that you're interacting and everything else? I said, well, I go where they are. Some of them are on LinkedIn, some of them are on Slack, some of them are on Teams, some of them are prefer using email still, some of them are using their own ESN, and I ask them to invite me, and I'm part of the conversations there. So what I do is I diversify based on the customer where I need to be, right?
So
Now people tell me,
I just want to go into that one, Lewis,
yeah,
because I remember a few years ago following
mm-hmm,
a long dialogue and a
mm-hmm,
conversation around your, I would call it maybe no email initiative. And
yeah,
I would say I'm an ambassador of anything. I don't know how many different messaging tools I have on my PC, because
right,
It's not about the messenger, but I studied NLP as part of communications and being a project manager and everything. And if
Hmm.
someone's very visual, they like to hear the stories that you want to tell in a visual manner. Or if they're very
Right,
kinesthetic, you're probably better off going for a walk with them. And the
right.
messaging kind of represents that. When you sort of mirror the preferred way of the person that you're talking to, you're
Right.
building rapport in some type of way that
Correct.
email is sort of this neutral generic thing, whereas if my preferred one is WhatsApp or Telegram or LinkedIn or whatever, and you
Hmm.
communicate back on where I'm comfortable, you've already made me feel that little bit more comfortable. Maybe you could tell us, because you've probably learned a lot, I imagine,
Right. Hmm.
about email, other messaging, and what the advantages are of meeting people where they're at.
Well, the thing is that I've been doing this no email initiative for 13 and a half years now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I've had all sorts of different questions coming from people as, why do you do it? How do you do it? And everything else. And there's one single one that keeps repeating itself over the years, right? And that is, how do you interact with customers? Because internally, we all have got the tools, we can pretty much do it, but it's very difficult to do it with customers because, the customers are in a different domain, they use
Sure.
different tools, so it's difficult to keep up, right? So they say, so what I do is I use email because that's the easiest way for me to actually do that. And what I always respond is that, yes, is the easiest way for you, but not for them. Because if you ask them, what is the number one tool that they hate when they interact with you? Email will be on top,
Right.
always. Why? Because you bombard them constantly. So the way around it is that if you offer an opportunity to say, hey, I want to stop using so much email with you, where else do you hang out? They will tell you, well, sometimes I'm on LinkedIn or, we
Sure.
use this as Slack space or Teams or whatever. And I will
Absolutely.
go and blankly say, can you invite me into one of those spaces? Because that way we can collaborate more intimately without me having to bombard you with email. And
Sure.
the answer from those folks has always been like, wow, we never had that before. And say, of course, because that's the difference between being customer centric versus vendor centric. The vendor centric, you are the one who pushes the messages out. The customer centric is you put yourself in the shoes of the customer and ask the customer, where are you hanging out? I want to hang out there, right? Now, people tell me, okay, yeah, but if you handle hundreds or thousands of customers, it becomes a nightmare. Of course, but no one handles hundreds or thousands of customers.
Sure.
You handle one or two or three at a time, which means that it's one, two, or three spaces at a time, right? And from a psychological perspective, our brain works much more effectively in fragments than as a whole.
Sure.
So if, for instance, you go and say, for this customer, I know that I need to go to Slack. For this other customer, I know that I need to go to Teams or to, an ESN or to, SharePoint or whatever, you will know, and I will associate that that tool goes with that customer. So when you need to talk to that customer, you will know exactly where to go, right?
Sure.
In your inbox is Pandora's box. Everything happens, which is why we struggle finding the stuff, right? And that's when it becomes a lot more nuanced and a lot more intimate, that you focus on the customer interactions, when and where they want to have them, not when you want to have them, in a way.
So there's two. You actually kind of gave me the highlight, the where and the when. So I'd
Right.
like to ask you about both of those. Maybe let me start with the when, because we were a
Hmm.
little bit on the where of which type of tools, and on the
Hmm.
when, the ability to manage when we communicate. Now, a lot of people even talk globally. So, it's the morning, you're talking to Asia, Europe during the day, at least for us European based, and then the evening, the States.
Right.
Now, to communicate effectively, we also need some time for ourselves as much as some
Right.
time to digest communication. Now, the tools are not built like that yet. So it
Right.
actually comes down to personal habits of, when will I look at my phone or look at my PC, or all of
Yeah.
these different communication applications. Like, ideally, I would have, let me set in when I plan to work today, and I
Hmm.
will get the messages during that time. And then they go on hold till the next window of I perceive to be work, work mode
Right.
on, work mode off type thing. But the tools are
Right.
not there yet. I do
Right.
that personally. And because, like yourself, I've been doing this for quite a while and get used to, how do people who are new to this, Lewis, this is where I'd like to ask you, new to this world of meeting people in different places online, Teams, Zoom,
Right,
Messenger, etc.,
right,
build a structure for themselves to
right.
to make the transition.
So I will start mentioning a few things, right?
Sure, please.
So number one is boundary setting, right? To basically ensure that you, as a worker, understand that you have got boundaries. And that means that you have got times when you're going to work and times when you're not going to work,
Sure.
right? So, for instance, one of the examples that I keep mentioning is that one of the things that I know from a lot of people who have been doing this kind of remote work now is that the moment that they get up, that's the moment when they start working. I don't. I
Mm,
get up at a certain time and I only start working at a certain time. And that time in between is my time to do
yes.
my thing, not your thing, right? And then the rest of the day, I will continue working. And then at the end of my workday, I set the boundary saying, this is how far I go. Anything else that comes here, you will not have a response until I come back the next day. So boundary setting is hugely important. Actually, is the number one obstacle that people tell you when working from home, that they keep working whole day long, Saturday and Sunday, on vacation or whatever. I say, yeah, because you haven't put any boundaries. And if you don't put any boundaries, work always wins. That's why work-life balance doesn't work,
Well,
right?
I just want to add into that is, the concept of presence. So if I
Right,
have a particular messaging system on and it says Jonathan is online, so we have a
right.
lot of assumptions around what online means and whether
Sure.
we even update our messages and our settings. So if you could
And I will say
elaborate that.
two things, and I will say two things on those, two other keywords, expectations and synchronous, asynchronous, right? So
Mhm,
expectations is you need to raise the right expectations as to when people can get hold of you, right?
mhm,
So for instance, for my colleagues, they know that before 10 o'clock, they won't get me.
mhm,
They know that I'm up, they know that I'm up and running, but they won't get me. Why?
mhm.
Because I have told them up front, I start working at 10, not before. So unless it is something critically, extremely urgent where you need me, I'm not going to answer anything else until I start working at 10, right? So setting the expectations with your customers, with your colleagues about when you're going to work and what you're going to be doing. So there's a whole concept around this, which is narrating your work, working out loud. So basically proactively telling who you interact with what you're going to be doing during the day. You know,
Sure.
what I'm going to be working on, what is your on time, the meetings and everything else, so that people have an expectation as to when they can interact with you. And the other big massive transition that we need to do is we need to move away from the synchronous work into asynchronous work. So I don't, in order for me to do my work, I should not depend on you for you to be online all the time. I should be able to use tools that allow me to work asynchronously. The whole thing around the web presence is so toxic. It's even worse than email because the moment that you see a green light, somehow you get the message that this person is available online so he can answer or she can answer my problem, my question yesterday. No,
Sure.
it means that they just started that work and whenever they reach you, they will get back to you, right?
So I'd love to
Now that,
tell a little story on that one, Lewis,
go
because
ahead,
it's
go ahead.
personal and maybe it helps. Is my father is from the older generation, so when he
Hmm.
would call me, if he doesn't get me, he'll call me again. He'll call me again, and not leave a message, whether that's on WhatsApp or on a traditional telephone. And we're 20 years, well, I don't know, 20 years, but we're a long time discussing. If you send me a message, as soon as I listen to that message, you'll get back to me. So whether you call me 5 times or 10, if I can't answer in that moment, I still can't answer. And it's that transition of presence to getting used to asynchronous. If I know I didn't catch you, I'll happily leave a written note or a voice
Yeah.
message. And I know when you get it, you'll get back to me. Asynchronous is probably for some of us it's okay, but not everybody has made that transition yet.
But it's that transition that needs to happen because if we don't, that's the one that is giving us most of that cognitive overload, right? That digital overload. The fact that we constantly need to be online, hour after hour, day after day, week after week, that's going to create a burden on us that we will not be able to recover from because we will eventually burn out. We will go into depression or whatever. We will fall sick and we will be sick for months because it's really hard to recover from that. right? That's why that transition from synchronous to asynchronous needs to happen. And it freaks a lot of people out when I tell them that usually my synchronous work daily is about 1 hour a day, one meeting or
Mm-hmm.
two. By default, I tell people if I can do the work asynchronously, I will do it asynchronously. So don't put up the meeting. And if you do, I will reject it, right? So what I do there is I basically tell people that we need to move into a way where you work your pace, I work my pace, and in between those paths, we will meet up and discuss what we need to discuss, right?
I
It's
love
not
that.
like we need to be all the time synchronously working real time. So I need to do now. I mean, I know the reason why people do that. Again, the reason why people do that kind of synchronous work is because they don't trust their colleagues or they don't trust their employees
Yeah.
to do their work, right?
Mm.
But when you actually, and this is, the way for folks to understand the transition that needs to happen is don't think of synchronous work, think of asynchronous work, but don't think about I don't trust them, wait for their results. If they deliver, so if the people who you're interacting with, they deliver in a timely manner, you should not worry whatsoever about synchronous work, right?
Sure.
Because if you're not there, but you still get the results, you still get the results, which is what you need to focus on, right? And that's the transition into asynchronous. So, for instance, whenever I use one of these messaging tools, Slack or Teams or
Yeah.
WhatsApp or whatever, if I see the person is online, I don't go and ask something and then I get immediate answer. My usual first line is, "Hey, whenever you have a minute, can you get back to me on this item, please?"
Sure.
Whenever you have a minute. So whenever you feel that it's the time for you to dedicate it to me for what I have, right? Obviously, if it is something urgent, I don't do messaging. I pick up the phone and I talk to people with audio. I know that we don't do that anymore, but hey, the phone is usually faster when you have got a critical emergency,
Well,
right?
what
But
you're
for the
describing
rest,
here is like rules of engagement, Lewis. And,
yeah,
and
it's
I
negotiation.
yeah,
It's,
but
it's negotiating. Is negotiating how you want to collaborate. People don't do that.
yeah,
People impose upon everyone else how they want everyone else to work. And I'm sorry, but that's not collaboration. That's
sure.
just you imposing your rule of law. I'm sorry, but that's obnoxious. I mean, every time that I bump into those folks who have that attitude, I tell them, bug off. I'm not interested. Say,
Yeah,
yeah, but I said, no, I'm not interested. Either we negotiate those rules of engagement, as you well mentioned, and we set out the right expectations, we create the boundaries, and we put what work needs to be done, what are the expected outcomes and results that need to come through. If we don't do that exercise before we start, I'm not interested. Why? Because I know that I will be working under your yoke, and I don't want that. That's not
so
how you collaborate.
so then, but my question is probably here's how I am, and maybe you can tell me is I love asynchronous communication by default.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Mm-hmm.
it's sort of an escalation to go synchronous. So I rather like even to organize this conversation between the two of us, it was a back and forth between LinkedIn
Yeah.
and a couple of messaging systems, and now we're having a synchronous real-time conversation, which is
Right.
fantastic. It's
Right.
exploratory and it needs to work in that way. But if
Yeah.
someone calls me and they could have easily sent me a voice message or typed me a message, it actually irritates me now at this stage.
Yeah.
If it was urgent, I accept that. It's not that, but how do we bring people? And I almost feel like a vampire who wants to bite another person's neck and say, let's convert them to asynchronous being the default, and then as requirements need or as needs must, we make that more synchronous. Now, obviously, by
You know,
interacting with me, you learn that, but
right. Right. At the end of the day, if you look into it, it's something that I have learned over the course of years in terms of how effective that is, and that is respecting symmetry, right? So the way I think into it, and I'm going to put an example into this, the
please.
way I think into it is, you know, I treat everyone that I interact with, whether it's a customer, business partner, someone else in the industry like ourselves and everything else, I treat them the way I would want to be treated, with respect and dignity of my time. You
Mm-hmm.
know, if I treat you that way, I expect that symmetry back. I expect that you will respect my time, you will respect my boundaries, you will respect my expectations, and oblige to them.
Mm-hmm.
If I do it and you don't, I'm going to go for you. I will be just as upset as you are, because you're basically telling me I don't care about you. I said, well, if you don't care about me, why should I care back? Tell me.
Sure.
This is an exercise where this is what I keep telling people, that we truly haven't understood the words collaboration or cooperation. It's a two-way street. It's a symmetrical two-way street. The way you treat others is the way others will treat you. So if you abuse that power and you basically impose yourself over everyone else, you're basically telling the other person, the other party, I don't care about you. I only care about me, 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 me. And what happens is that people eventually turn off and they
Sure.
eventually don't bother, which is why you see a lot of people that send message after message hundreds of times demanding for an answer when they get totally ignored. Why do they get totally ignored? Because they have wasted the opportunity of engaging in a meaningful manner, respectful manner, right? So again, what I do is I tell people, I want to treat people the way I would want to be treated, with respect, with care, with dignity. And if something as a result of that comes forward, great. If not, it still is great, because I feel that we have respected each other as professionals,
Absolutely.
right? And from there onwards, it's also how you build into that asynchronous world, how you build into trusting people that they will do what they need to do, and how you learn that once you set those boundaries, once you set that discipline of, keeping up with expectations and everything else, you actually start enjoying the interactions and the work and the output that you put together. And you realize that once you see that light, there's no way back. I mean, one of the things, like I said, I have worked for 20 years distributedly, and I have worked, many of those years was when I was at IBM,
Mm-hmm.
different, different business units, different
Sure.
projects. Then I had my own business, and then I have been working now with Pan Agenda for nearly 5 years now, right? And I know that my main, you know, my main goal here is to help people understand that whatever the job that I was doing, whatever the work that I was doing, there was always something for me that was key and essential, which is work in this manner as distributed worker. Why? Because I saw the light of what it is like working asynchronously, of setting my own boundaries, of having a good quality life, of having the opportunity to contribute with good results as opposed to struggle to make everything happen, right?
Yeah.
So once you set into those boundaries and once you understand the constraints that you have and everything else, then the rest is just non-existent, because what you do is you establish a work of flow where you benefit from it, but also everyone else. Why? Because the way you treat others is the way others will treat you, hopefully, right?
Sure.
And I'm saying hopefully because you never know, you'll have assholes everywhere, right? So, sometimes you will have
You have to deal
folks
with
who
it.
will not
Yeah.
respect it, right? But in general, people will actually do that and oblige to that. And that helps you understand that you're in a different league in terms of how you work, right? And in terms of how you respect people's times, in terms of how you respect people's workloads. It's not like, everything that you do has priority over what they do.
Sure.
It's not that, right? So that's why it's so important that art of negotiation and setting those boundaries, because that's what's going to help you understand whether you're ready to move from synchronous into asynchronous, right? And then people tell me, yeah, but asynchronous is working blindly. And said no, because I can go into all of the various different social and digital tools and I can read through everything that has been going on, because everyone is being narrating their work or working out loud. So they proactively have been setting up their boundaries and expectations with all their teams, and you're just picking into that. Now, when you're face to face, no one is going to do that, right? But when you're in a digital environment, it's literally the default that people will use, right? Is bringing forward that clarity, right? In terms of who's doing what and when does it need to be done, right? And when you start saying that it's an exercise where you remove frictions, lots of frictions, right? And once you remove those, that flow, literally, that flow of work is what makes it worthwhile switching from that synchronous well into the synchronous well. No way.
Fantastic. Yeah, I can even see how you set the landscape there by saying that moving to digital has also limited the amount of sort of control interaction. So there's more, I'm not saying equal, but more similar interaction, and therefore
Balanced.
people are more free to sort
Yeah.
of talk about their boundaries, whereas
Yeah.
before that wasn't even really an option in a face-to-face
Yeah.
manner.
Because people were imposing their own agendas, right? Whereas now it is like, okay, with everything you have to do and with everything that I have to do, where is our common ground? Can we negotiate it? And that's eventually how a collaboration happens, is when you care for what you do, but you also care for what everyone else does and how you can fit it in, right? And sometimes, when people tell you, you know what, I'm fully loaded today, can it wait until tomorrow?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if it is not urgent, yes, of course it can wait. But
Yeah.
now I know that because I have the expectations that you have raised with me that today is not a good day. Whereas in the other way of working is like, yeah, I want you in a web meeting like by tomorrow at 10 o'clock because we need to talk about this topic.
Sure.
That's so disrespectful in terms of people's workflows and how they actually work and what they need to be doing and everything else, that I find it mind blowing. And working from home through the pandemic has exposed a lot of these dysfunctions about what we used to do at the office that we tried to do online. And what I'm hoping is that, once the pandemic fades away, that people will stop for a minute, have a lot of thinking time in terms of saying, this is what I used to do at the office. This is what I did while the pandemic was going on from home.
Yeah.
Which one is the best of both worlds, or what do I want to have from one world and the other that fits my needs and the folks that I work with, and then go with that, right?
Wonderful.
And I think that that's the exercise that's going to happen over the next year, the next 2 years, which is why it's being flagged as the hybrid workplace. To me, it's a lame excuse, because organizations just need to figure out, or want to figure out, what they're going to do with all of the real estate before they tell everyone to go away and work anywhere.
So
Right.
where that brings me, I'm loving the insights, and in some way, it's almost a psychology lesson as much as a discussion around the workplace and this new environment. And in that new world, we also need leadership and how to navigate that. And I think even just during this conversation, you've been granting that to us, Lewis, by
Right.
exploring those topics that some people are struggling with now, and at least there's clarity of what options you might have in terms of how you set up your boundaries, how you communicate, when not to, etc. What
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to ask, I love to ask all my guests, is if you could talk to the 16 or 18-year-old Lewis and say to him, here's a piece of advice that would be really useful for you. Go back and imagine that young man that you were, and you were 16 or 18 years of age, and you haven't done all the things that you had done. What might you say to that young man?
Um, it's funny that you asked that question, because I went into IT by accident,
Uh-huh.
right? I never studied science or computing engineering or anything else. I'm an English teacher, right?
Yeah.
So I did humanities. So what I would have told that 16-year-old now is, I should have gone into anthropology. I should have become an
That's the study of human
anthropologist.
behavior, isn't it?
Yes, but more in the sense of, because when with all of the background that I have now, I have now understood the role of anthropology within organizations. I mean, the study of human behavior usually happens in a societal level, right?
Sure.
So how societies, but at work, we don't have enough ethnographers and anthropologists, right? And we should, because if you look into it, and you just describe it right now, work is a lot of psychology. It's a lot of, behavior, habits, customs, ways of, doing things that come from inertia, that come from conformity and everything else. So when you think about change management, when you think about change initiatives, that's the last item that we usually look into. Why? Because there's not enough expertise inside organizations that I can go to. I don't know any organization, well, maybe, I'm sorry, I should say, I know one or two organizations that have got anthropologists within HR to
Wow.
understand how people work, right? But they're two, right? They're two. Whereas I feel that every organization should have someone who will look into those aspects, who will look, and it's not culture, it's behavior. Is why do we do the things that we do? What's the purpose? right? And having an understanding on that for all of the employees will give an opportunity to draw patterns on things that work and things that don't work, and what we can then do on the things that don't work. So again, if I were advising to that young 16-year-old, I would say go into anthropology because you will be enjoying the work.
Yeah.
You will probably be very good at it over time because it's all about conversations that you have and learning and
Sure.
everything else. And we're moving and transitioning into a world where, fun enough, is technology driven, and yet the demand for humanities, for arts, for social sciences has never been higher than ever before. So
I think that's wonderful, and I'd love to explore it just a tiny little bit. My limited knowledge of anthropology boils down to two pieces of information. When in 1991, I went to the Anthropological Museum in Mexico City and discovered loads of amazing facts about us that I never knew. And then several years later, I read a book by a guy called Desmond Morris, The Naked Ape, which basically compares the behaviors of man and monkey effectively. Now, anthropology is the study of behavior. When you say anthropology in the workplace, because just what you said is a new concept for me to get my head around a little bit, Lewis. Give us a sort of simplified, what is anthropology in the workplace for you?
So it's eventually that opportunity of studying behavior at work, not when we are living in a society, not when we are living, with our families, with our local communities and everything else. So it's when you're interacting, usually it's when you're interacting with the strangers, your colleagues, when you're interacting with something called incentives. So why do you do the things that you do? What are the incentives that motivate you to do X, Y, Z? You may have intrinsic, you may have extrinsic motivations in there. And also things like, what is the purpose in terms of what you want to do? What kind of footprint or what kind of, legacy do you want to leave behind, right? So studying all of that will give you the opportunity to understand what motivates people to come to work. And if you can then influence the conditions under what that operates, then you will have the opportunity to change to succeed, right? So it's funny that you mentioned the Naked Ape, because about 2.5 years ago, I was doing this work with a university in mainland Spain. And I was actually working with a professor there who was an anthropologist with 40 years in the field, right, across different continents, studying the way tribes would, behave and everything else. And he told me about the three monkeys as opposed to the naked monkey, the naked ape, which was, the thief monkey, the jealous monkey, and the aggressive monkey. Okay. And describing each of those in the workplace, you see plenty of it. You have got the thief monkey, so that's the monkey that tries to steal from everything and everyone. We by nature are thief monkeys because we steal from nature, right?
Yeah.
The jealous monkey is the one that wants what the neighbor has. So if I am the boss and you're not, and the boss has got fancy office, I want to have a fancy office. If the boss has got, 2 or 3 personal assistants, I want to have 1 or 2 personal assistants, right? That's the jealous or envious monkey. And the aggressive monkey is the one that wants to have everything with violence, through violence, right? Which can be verbal or physical. So if you look at, so he told me about these things, and I thought, like, bloody hell, he's just describing my last 20 years in the workplace of what I have seen every single day, And I went like, why didn't I study this? Right? That was a big aha moment for me, right? But the thing is that then obviously he was painting this picture, and I told him, you realize that that's how the corporate world works, right? With those 3 monkeys. And then I said to him, so you need to give me something positive. Like how do we survive? How have we survived over the course of the last 2 billion years as a species, right? And then he said, you know what? We have those monkeys. We are those monkeys at times, right? But there's one thing that makes us all unique in that, and that is that when things get really tough, when things are really bad, we cooperate. And our means of survival is through cooperation within the species. It's why we are where we're here, because we cooperate when we are in really deep shit. And excuse my French, right? And he was right. He was right, because when you look into how organizations have survived for decades, despite exhibiting this kind of behaviors with those 3 types of monkeys, when things were really tough, they eventually came together and cooperated to help the organization survive. And they did, right? So are we there on that tipping point where we need to start thinking about cooperation in order for us to survive? My answer would be that we're pretty there. We're pretty close there, because there's this underlying threat with regards to climate change, right? And I think that that's the tipping point that will help us forget whatever we were doing and cooperate as a mere matter of survival. Also in the workplace. And that's why anthropology is so fascinating in terms of studying that behavior, human behavior, and how you can apply it then, with the work of complexity, right? And have better understanding that once you know how, or once you have the intuition of how organizations work with individuals and everything else, you have the opportunity to influence conditions to change. And then from there, once change happens. And an example, before the pandemic, very few people were working from home. It was actually seen as a dirty word. That if you're working from home, you're slacking off. You're on the beach, or you're doing the laundry, or nibbling in the fridge, or whatever. So no, sorry, we don't do remote working here or distributed work, right? Then the conditions change. The pandemic came up, and all of a sudden, because the conditions changed, we had to change, and we eventually changed. And now the genie is out of the bottle, so it's going to be very difficult to get that genie back in the bottle, which means that because the conditions have shifted forever, that change will be taking place, right? We may deviate and go back to some of what we do,
Sure.
or some of what we did in the past, but not all of it. And eventually, once you understand that human behavior, and once you understand how you can change those conditions under which humans operate, change is, I'm not going to say easy, but it's doable in a way. And that's what I find fascinating.
I would just like to say thank you for your insights. It's been
My pleasure.
fabulous conversation. You have new synapses going off in my brain now, whether they're my monkey brain or my real brain, I'm not sure, but I absolutely love the conversation, Lewis. It's been
My pleasure
to have you on the podcast. For those of you who are following Questions of Fire, I would highly recommend Lewis. I've been personally following for several years now and keeping in touch base with him every now and again. And I love the content. He is, in one of the words that he used during this conversation, an adapter. He's an early adapter, a late adapter, every type of adaptation. And Charles Darwin said, it's not the strong or the fastest who survive, but those who adapt. And I would think of Lewis as an exemplary example to all of us to listen to and be in his conversation. LinkedIn is where I follow him most. Lewis, is there any other particular place where people?
Yeah, I'm using Twitter, although I'm having a bit of a relationship, love hate with it at the moment. So I'm on the hate phase. So
Okay.
that will disappear soon enough, right? So folks can follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn, or also my personal blog, elsewhere.net. You can find me there. Or if you just want to go the lazy way out, just look on Google Luis Suarez, and I'm not the one who plays football. So
brilliant. Actually, I had to mention that. I said this 3 weeks ago. I said I'm going to have Luis Suarez on the. No way, Dad! No way! And I said no. It's a friend who lives in the Canaries, not the football player.
And they were like, "Oh God." I know. So that's the easiest way of how people can find me, right?
Fantastic. And I will put all of Lewis's contact details under wherever this appears, and please follow him. Thank you very much for your time, Lewis. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me, and hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. And we'll see you soon again.
All right. Take care.
Take care. See you later.